June 6, 1944. A cold, grey dawn stretched across the English Channel. As the mist lifted, an unimaginable sight took shape. The greatest armada mankind had ever assembled. 7,000 vessels moved in unison. Aboard them were 130,000 men, with hearts steeled for the storm ahead. Overhead, the drone of 20,000 Allied aircraft cut through the clouds, a metallic hum of destiny. As light broke, hell descended. Thunderous bombardment rained down on the Normandy coast. Amid the firestorm, wave after wave of soldiers disembarked, while 20,000 paratroopers had already landed behind enemy lines. By nightfall, 10,500 Allied troops would lie dead or wounded, matched by nearly as many Germans. Within 11 weeks, Paris would be free and the road to Berlin open, not with celebration, but through relentless sacrifice. This is the story of Operation Overlord, as lived by generals and foot soldiers, paratroopers and resistance fighters, Allied cameramen, and even the enemy. From Eisenhower, Bradley, Montgomery, and Churchill to Rommel, the Desert Fox, and the anonymous men who carried rifles, cameras, and hope, among them Sergeant Ian Grant, who dared to film the front line. At the Tehran Conference in December 1943, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt debated when and where to strike the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. Stalin had begged for a second front since 1941. Churchill preferred an indirect approach through Italy, but Roosevelt, now convinced the West must deliver the decisive blow, pushed for an invasion in France. Hitler had anticipated this and ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a 4,000-mile fortress of bunkers, mines, and steel traps. By January 1944, Eisenhower had arrived in London. He appointed Montgomery to lead ground operations, and together they secretly selected Normandy over Calais due to weaker German defenses. Montgomery expanded the landing zone to include Caen and Cherbourg, essential for logistics. Rommel, sent to oversee coastal defenses, was denied the air support he needed and instead focused on laying mines and flooding inland fields. Meanwhile, the Allies constructed massive artificial ports and floating Rhodes mulberries that would be towed across the Channel after the landing. Troops trained relentlessly, equipment was tested, yet even in drills, lives were lost. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers arrived in Britain, greeted by donuts, ration envy, and British girls. Eisenhower spoke directly to the young men at Sandhurst, knowing many would not return. Cameramen like Desmond O'Neill and Ian Grant recorded the preparation. The entire Channel coast was photographed in detail by the Allies, aided by the French. Resistance. Disinformation campaigns fooled the Germans into thinking the real attack would hit Calais. Inflatable tanks, fake airfields, and dummy ships were deployed. By late May, Allied camps were locked down. Tension built. On June 4th, a violent storm forced Eisenhower to delay the invasion. Morale dropped. Then, on the evening of June 5th, the weather broke. Ike made the call. That night, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne took off, their faces painted black and red, their odds barely even. Eisenhower watched them go, having written a note accepting full responsibility if the invasion failed. As they jumped into France, Allied bombers lit the night sky. Railroads, bridges, and gun batteries were destroyed. At dawn, naval artillery opened up. Omaha Beach was a slaughterhouse. Green units and veterans alike were dropped far from shore. Many drowned under the weight of their gear. Those who reached land were pinned by machine guns. Robert Capa captured the terror in a handful of surviving photographs. Commanders considered abandoning Omaha, but retreat meant abandoning the wounded and losing the war. So they held. Ike addressed the world, calling for faith and resolve, across a 45-mile front. An armada pushed forward. The Germans, deceived by Allied ruses, delayed their response. Allied planes flew 10,000 missions. Resistance fighters sabotaged roads and rail lines. At Sword Beach, the British landed and fought toward Caen. O'Neill filmed the chaos until he was shot. Grant followed, capturing scenes of courage and confusion. At Juno Beach, the Canadians landed under fire and pushed inland toward the Carpiquet airfield. 300 died, but their beachhead held. At Omaha, 3,000 Americans lay dead or wounded. But by nightfall, they too held the line. 2 days later, Montgomery arrived. Caen remained in German hands. German counterattacks began. The 12th SS Panzer Division stopped the British advance. Caen, bombed repeatedly, was not taken. Allied paratroopers, scattered across Normandy, suffered heavy losses but kept the Germans off balance. On June 9th, the town of Isigny was taken, linking the American beaches and securing the front. General de Gaulle returned to France through Courcelles. Churchill distrusted him, but Eisenhower gave him the spotlight. In Bayeux, de Gaulle asserted control, appointing local officials and establishing French authority. Meanwhile, artificial ports called mulberries were deployed. Every day, thousands of tons of supplies, vehicles, and troops arrived. Then disaster struck. A massive storm hit the channel, crippling the American harbor at Omaha. The British port at Arromanches barely survived. The invasion plan was delayed by 10 days. To regain momentum, the Americans turned toward Cherbourg. After brutal fighting, they took the port on June 26th. German General von Schlieben surrendered. 22,000 American lives had already been lost. Among the prisoners were young boys and old men, the last dregs of Hitler's Western Army. Hitler replaced von Rundstedt with von Kluge and insisted on no retreat. Rommel grew disillusioned. American troops faced a nightmare in the Bocage Normandy's dense hedgerows and narrow lanes. Tanks were ambushed. Fields became death traps. Morale plummeted. Bradley launched Operation Cobra, a massive bombing campaign near Caen. It worked. The German front collapsed. Patton's armored divisions surged forward, racing across western France. The 2nd French Armored Division, led by General Leclerc, landed at Utah Beach. These were Free French, finally home. With the German front buckling, Hitler launched a final counterattack at Mortain. It failed. Allied aircraft obliterated German columns. Von Kluge committed suicide. Bradley sprung the trap. As Patton pushed north and the British moved south, the Germans were encircled at Falaise. Bombs rained down. Artillery pounded the roads. Eisenhower later said only Dante could describe it. Tens of thousands were killed or captured. The German army in Normandy was destroyed. Patton crossed the Seine and headed for Paris. The city had risen in revolt. Barricades went up. German troops fled. De Gaulle persuaded Eisenhower to liberate Paris directly to avoid chaos and communist influence. Leclerc's division entered the city on August 25th. Civilians filled the streets. Flags flew, tears flowed, the tricolor returned. De Gaulle walked the Champs-Élysées in triumph. The next day, at Place de la Concorde, he stood before the French people. Eisenhower and Bradley stood behind him, quiet but firm. The Americans knew the war would continue, but they also knew France must be free. Whether captured in black and white or color, every frame of footage told the story of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. Soldiers, medics, paratroopers, engineers, resistance fighters, and cameramen. Their faces blur into history, but their courage remains. As the Allies surged forward from Paris, the German army retreated chaotically across northern France. Bridges were blown, roads mined, but the momentum was now entirely with the Allied forces. Patton's Third Army pushed east with relentless speed, liberating towns and villages one after another. Civilians greeted them with flowers, wine, and tears. In Belgium and Luxembourg, crowds poured into the streets. The Nazi grip was loosening across Western Europe. Yet the war was far from over. As the Allies reached the borders of Germany, resistance stiffened. The Siegfried Line, Hitler's western defensive barrier, still stood. Mines, bunkers, and traps slowed the Allied advance. In the skies above, dogfights returned as the Luftwaffe fought back desperately. On the ground, German snipers, now often mere teenagers, defended every village with suicidal tenacity. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet Red Army was advancing rapidly, smashing through Axis forces and liberating Eastern Europe. With every passing day, Hitler's Reich shrank, yet the violence only intensified. Cities like Aachen, Cologne, and Metz saw some of the bloodiest urban combat of the war. Entire neighborhoods were flattened by artillery before being taken block by block. In the Ardennes, Hitler launched a surprise winter counter-offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Allied lines bent but did not break. Thousands of American troops were trapped in Bastogne, surrounded and freezing, until Patton broke through with his armored columns in late December. The tide turned once more. As spring approached in 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine into Germany itself. Concentration camps began to be discovered. The horrors of the Holocaust came to light. Dachau. The images captured by Allied cameramen were unbearable. Starving survivors, mass graves, and the mechanized cruelty of genocide stunned the world. Back in Paris, life slowly resumed. The Eiffel Tower was lit once more. Children returned to school. But the scars ran deep. Families torn apart, cities in ruins, collaborators tried and punished. De Gaulle established a provisional government. France was free but forever changed. In Berlin, Soviet troops reached the city in April. The final battles of the European war were fought amid rubble and ash. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life in a bunker beneath the collapsing Reich Chancellery. 1 week later, Germany surrendered. Victory in Europe was declared on May 8th. The war in the Pacific continued, but in Europe, guns fell silent. For the millions who had fought, died, or survived, a new chapter began, rebuilding, remembering, reconciling. Across Normandy, fields once littered with bodies grew green again. Cemeteries rose on those beaches. Omaha, Juno, Goldware, rows of white crosses now stand watch. The story of June 6, 1944, does not end with victory. It endures in memory, in the gratitude of free nations, and in the faces of those who, young and afraid, crossed the sea to liberate a continent. In the months that followed, the Allied momentum became unstoppable. Town after town fell as the Axis defenses crumbled. As American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces liberated more territories, the local populations emerged from cellars and forests, gaunt from hunger but rich in hope. In cities like Brussels, Antwerp, and Strasbourg, people danced in the streets, sang their national songs, and wrapped themselves in flags that had long been forbidden under Nazi occupation. The joy of freedom came with the bitter taste of Losmany. Families would never reunite, and the wounds carved by collaboration and betrayal would take decades to heal. Resistance fighters who had lived in the shadows now emerged in uniform, hailed as heroes, though their ranks had included both saints and opportunists. Trials were held. Summary justice was sometimes carried out. Women accused of consorting with the occupiers had their heads shaved in public squares. Justice was raw and uneven, but for a nation reclaiming its soul, the process had begun. Meanwhile, military leaders turned their attention to the final push into the heart of Nazi Germany. Supply lines had to be maintained over vast stretches of liberated territory. An entire engineering corps were dedicated to rebuilding destroyed bridges, clearing mines, and restoring rail lines. Civilians often assisted, guiding Allied troops through their terrain, cooking meals, offering shelter, and burying the dead. Every day brought new discoveries: abandoned German command posts, lost Allied equipment, letters never delivered, and sometimes entire villages that had been erased in the fog of war. In December 1944, the Germans launched a surprise counteroffensive in the Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge. It was Hitler's last gamble, and it caught the Allies off guard. The forests of Belgium turned into killing fields once again, as tanks bogged down in snow and young soldiers froze in foxholes. But the Americans held, notably at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne famously refused to surrender. General Patton's Third Army executed a bold maneuver and relieved the siege. After bitter fighting, the Germans were forced back, and their western front was effectively destroyed. In early 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine. The heartland of Germany lay open. Towns like Mainz, Mannheim, and Nuremberg fell in quick succession. German soldiers began surrendering in large numbers, but pockets of resistance still fought to the end. In some places, Nazi loyalists committed atrocities in desperation. In others, civilians hanged white flags from windows, begging for mercy. In these final days, chaos reigned. Refugees clogged the roads. Bridges were blown up behind retreating units. American and British bombers continued their raids, targeting industrial cities like Dresden in one of the most controversial episodes of the war. Simultaneously, in the east, the Soviet Red Army was advancing with overwhelming force, liberating Warsaw, Budapest, and finally reaching Berlin. As the Allies advanced from both sides, Germany's defeat was inevitable. In April, Berlin was encircled. Hitler, refusing to flee, remained in his bunker. As Soviet troops closed in, he took his own life. The Third Reich, once promised to last 1,000 years, collapsed after barely 12. On May 8, 1945, Germany formally surrendered. Victory in Europe Day was declared. Bells rang across the free world. Soldiers embraced. Civilians wept. In Times Square, strangers kissed in celebration. But amid the euphoria was exhaustion, mourning, and disbelief at the scale of destruction. Europe lay shattered. Cities reduced to ashes. Families divided by borders, politics, and loss. The Holocaust's full horror came into focus as Allied troops liberated Camps Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald, revealing scenes of such suffering that even hardened soldiers broke down. In the weeks after victory, the process of rebuilding began. Occupied zones were established. War crimes tribunals were convened. Refugees tried to return home. Some had no homes left. In France, Charles de Gaulle worked to re-establish a unified national government. Across Britain and the United States, soldiers began the long journey home, changed forever by what they had seen and endured. Others remained to serve in the occupation of Germany, a shattered country grappling with its guilt, ruins, and future. The beaches of Normandy, once thunderous with cannon fire, grew quiet again. Farmers returned to their fields, children to their schools. Cemeteries rose where bodies had fallen, neatly kept rows of white marble crosses and stars of David. Visitors began to come, first a few, then many, families tracing names, veterans, returning to the exact spot they had landed, sometimes standing silently for hours, remembering those who hadn't made it. The legacy of D-Day became etched not only in stone but in memory, in history books, in films, in classrooms, and in the collective conscience of a generation. It was not a day of glory but of necessity, a day where ordinary young men from Kansas, Liverpool, Montreal, and Lyon became extraordinary, not because they sought fame, but because they followed orders, helped one another, and carried the weight of freedom on their backs. The story of June 6th is not just about military triumph, it's about human resilience, sacrifice, and the courage to face unimaginable fear. It was not a clean war, and it did not end neatly, but it mattered. It mattered then, and it matters still. As the guns of Europe fell silent, the world shifted its gaze to the east, where the war still raged in the Pacific, while the cities of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands began the long road to recovery. American forces turned their attention to Japan. The brutality of warfare in the Pacific had been different. In nature fought on small islands, in dense jungles, under sweltering heat, and against an enemy that rarely surrendered. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were fought with savage intensity. Kamikaze pilots crashed their aircraft into Allied ships. Civilians, misled by propaganda, sometimes leaped from cliffs rather than fall into enemy hands. Back home, Allied nations watched with a mixture of pride and sorrow. War bonds funded the final stretch. Mothers wrote letters that never reached the battlefield. Factories ran day and night, producing weapons and rations for sons, brothers, and husbands who were now halfway round the world. The decision to end the war came with a moral weight heavier than any battlefield choice. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Within days, Japan surrendered. The war that had engulfed every continent, drawn in every empire, and reshaped every economy was finally over. The final death toll would never be truly known. Over 70 million dead, including millions of civilians. Entire cultures were upended, borders redrawn, governments toppled. The scale of destruction had no precedent. The term World War had become painfully literal. In the aftermath, a new kind of battle began, the battle to rebuild, to reconcile, and to remember. Across Europe and Asia, displaced persons roamed the landscape, searching for family, shelter, and meaning. Refugee camps became temporary cities. Nations were split not only by politics but by ideology. In Germany, once the epicenter of fascist terror, a nation was divided into East and West by a new invisible wall, one made of suspicion and fear. The Cold War was born not in a single moment, but in 1,000 gestures of mistrust. In Eastern Europe, Soviet-backed regimes took control. In the West, democratic institutions were rebuilt, often with American support. The Marshall Plan poured billions into reconstruction. Cities like Rotterdam and Warsaw rose from ashes. Roads, railways, and factories returned to life. But trauma lingered in France. De Gaulle's leadership gave the country a sense of continuity. But the scars of occupation and collaboration would take decades to address. Trials for war criminals unfolded across Europe. In Nuremberg, the architects of Nazi terror stood in judgment before the world. Some were executed, others imprisoned. Many escaped justice. The trials, though limited in scope, set a precedent for international law that crimes against humanity would not be ignored. At the same time, a new institution emerged from the rubble of war. The United Nations, formed in 1945, its purpose was simple but profound: to prevent another global conflict. But peace, as always, would be fragile. In the Middle East, colonial retreat gave way to new tensions. In Asia, the Chinese Civil War resumed. In Vietnam, seeds of a new conflict were already sown. Back in the Allied countries, returning soldiers faced the complex process of reintegration. Some came home to open arms, to marriages, to new children they had never met. Others came home to silence, unemployment, or trauma they could not explain. Terms like shell shock or battle fatigue were whispered but poorly understood. Entire generations of men bore invisible wounds. Some drank, some wandered, some turned their experiences into books, films, or silence. Women, who had taken up roles in factories, hospitals, and command posts, were often asked to step back into traditional roles. Some did, others didn't. The social fabric had shifted, however subtly, and there would be no full return to the pre-war world in schools and homes. Stories of D-Day and the war were passed down not just through textbooks, but through photo albums, folded uniforms, and medals placed quietly in drawers. Children grew up playing war, not always understanding the pain behind the stories. As time passed, veterans began to speak more freely. Documentaries, oral histories, and films like Saving Private Ryan or The Longest Day captured the horror and heroism of those moments. Museums were built, memorials erected, cemeteries maintained with reverence and solemnity. On the cliffs of Normandy, white crosses stretch across green lawns, each one a name, a story, a life cut short. On anniversaries, presidents, queens, and old soldiers gather to remember. Taps is played, wreaths are laid. Tears still come, but beyond the ceremonies lies a deeper truth, that the men who landed on June 6th were not seeking medals. They were not chasing glory. They were doing their duty. Many were barely out of high school. Some had never left their hometowns. Some had never seen the ocean until they crossed it. On that morning, they faced a wall of bullets, fear, and chaos, and still they moved forward. In doing so, they cracked the foundation of tyranny and began the liberation of a continent. As the decades rolled on, the generation that fought in World War II began to fade. The veterans who once stood tall now walked with canes or rode in wheelchairs. Their stories became part of the world's moral memory, a reminder of what happens when democracy is attacked, when hate is left unchecked, and when the world looks away. They taught us not only how to win a war, but how to value peace, how to resist fear, how to stand for something larger than ourselves. In the years that followed, the generation who had fought across the beaches of Normandy, through the hedgerows of France, and into the heart of Germany came to be known as the greatest generation, not only for their courage in battle, but for the way they rebuilt the broken pieces of the world after the war ended. Across Europe, reconstruction became a daily rhythm. In France, new bridges replaced those that had been bombed. Cities like Le Havre and Caen, once shattered, rose from ashes with modern designs, clean lines, and monuments to memory. In Britain, rationing would continue for years, and the war's psychological weight would shape a culture of perseverance, modesty, and quiet dignity. In the United States, returning veterans used the GI Bill to attend college, buy homes, and begin the post-war economic boom that would define the 1950s. They became teachers, factory workers, doctors, engineers. The sons of farmers returned as citizens of the world. Yet for many, the war lived on in their dreams. Nightmares of machine gun fire, of friends screaming, of waves crashing over bodies on Omaha beach haunted their sleep. PTSD, though unnamed for decades, took root in silence. In the eastern half of Europe, the war's end did not bring freedom, but another kind of occupation. The Soviet Union extended its influence through puppet regimes, secret police, and ideological control. East Berlin was severed from the West. Families were divided by a wall that symbolized a new kind of war. Cold War fought, not with tanks and bullets, but with espionage, propaganda, and political brinkmanship. Yet even in the East, the memory of Nazi occupation lingered, and many who had once fought for survival now became agents of dissent. Artists, writers, musicians, many of whom had suffered in the camps or the resistance, used their voices to tell the truth when their governments would not. Their courage, like that of the soldiers on DID, became part of a larger legacy of defiance against tyranny. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Germany, a long process of reckoning began. Ordinary citizens were forced to confront the atrocities committed. In their name, the phrase "Wir haben es nicht gewusst," "we didn't know," echoed hollow across the country. Denazification began, though inconsistently. Some former Nazis were imprisoned, others reintegrated into civil society. The post-war trials of Nuremberg established legal standards for crimes against humanity and inspired future justice movements. Yet not all wounds healed quickly. Survivors of the Holocaust carried their trauma across generations. Jewish communities that had once flourished in cities like Warsaw, Prague, and Vienna were now scattered or erased. The State of Israel was born out of the ashes, offering a homeland for a people long persecuted, back in Normandy. The beaches that had once been battlefields became sacred ground. Pilgrimages began by families, veterans, students. The silence of those shores now spoke louder than any speech. Plaques in multiple languages told visitors what had happened there, but the wind and waves carried the story best. The tide washed over sand where thousands had fallen. In small towns nearby, locals maintained graves and monuments with quiet devotion. For them, the men who had landed there were not just soldiers, they were liberators. In places like Saint-Mere, Église, airborne troops who had died tangled in trees were remembered as saviors. Children grew up playing under American flags. In schoolbooks, D-Day became more than a date, it became the moment when freedom fought back and won. The influence of the war extended even further. It shaped literature and cinema, music and art. Novels like Catch-22, The Naked and the Dead, and Slaughterhouse-Five offered unvarnished views of the soldiers' experience. Films from The Longest Day to Saving Private Ryan recreated the terror and chaos of Normandy. These portrayals helped future generations understand, even faintly, the scale of what had been done. And yet, for all the recognition, so much remained unspoken. The quiet bravery of medics who risked their lives to save others under fire, the chaplains who prayed with the dying, the engineers who built bridges overnight while shells fell around. Them, the signalers who guided aircraft under a storm of flak, their names, often forgotten, were stitched into the victory as surely as any general's plan. The legacy of D-Day also influenced how nations prepared for the future. NATO was formed not just as a military alliance, but as a safeguard against the kind of tyranny Europe had seen twice in 1 century. International cooperation was no longer a dream, it was a necessity. Institutions were born from the lessons of war. The European Union, decades later, would grow out of an idea that economic unity could prevent conflict. Though not perfect, it was built upon the ruins of past hostility. And so, the beaches of Normandy became more than cemeteries or historical sites. They became symbols of what the world could achieve when it refused to yield to hatred. As time marched on, the veterans aged. Their numbers dwindled. On each D-Day anniversary, fewer could attend. Wheelchairs replaced rifles. Salutes grew weaker, but no less heartfelt. They wore their medals not with pride, but with humility. They had not come to conquer. They had come to free. Schoolchildren interviewed them. Presidents thanked them. The world listened, finally, while it still could. In those interviews, one could hear a common refrain. They did not think of themselves as heroes. The real heroes, they often said, were the ones who never came home, the ones still buried under the soil of France, the ones whose names were carved into marble, but who lived forever in the memories of their brothers in arms. And so, the story of June 6, 1944, stretches far beyond that single day. It lives in the freedoms we enjoy, in the alliances we keep, in the choices we make when confronted with injustice. It is a story of ordinary people rising to meet extraordinary challenges, a story of risk, of suffering, of determination, and above all, of unity. That morning on the beaches of Normandy was not the beginning of the end, but it was, as Churchill said, perhaps the end of the beginning. It was the moment the world turned, because brave men in wet boots and heavy gear refused to stop moving. Forward, they climbed cliffs, they crossed fields, they freed towns, they changed history. As the decades passed, the generation of men and women who had lived through World War II came to symbolize not only the victory of arms, but the triumph of spirit. Their resilience became the foundation upon which modern democracies were built. They had seen what hate could do, how it could seduce a nation, turn neighbors against one another, and consume the world in fire. And they had also seen what unity, sacrifice, and conviction could achieve. In classrooms, children learned their history through textbooks, timelines, and faded photographs. But the living memory came from grandparents who spoke slowly, with heavy eyes, as they recalled the moment their ship approached the shore, or the first time they heard the staccato rhythm of machine gun fire over crashing waves. Some told their stories freely, others never spoke a word. Silence, for many, was the only way to keep the war from living on in their families. As societies changed, so too did the way we remembered war. In the 1960s and 70s, amid civil rights movements, student protests, and anti-war demonstrations over Vietnam, the image of the soldier became more complex. Yet through every upheaval, the story of D-Day remained a point of reference, reminder that sometimes war was not about politics or ambition, but about confronting evil with courage. Historians debated tactics and outcomes, but no one could debate the raw human bravery of those who leaped into the surf under fire, or who parachuted into darkness not knowing where they'd land. That courage transcended ideology. With the rise of digital media in the 21st century, a new generation discovered the war through film, video games, virtual reality tours, and online archives. What once took years of research could now be accessed. In seconds, interviews with veterans were uploaded to YouTube. Photographs once kept in attics were digitized and shared across continents. Projects like the Shoah Foundation and the Veterans History Project collected thousands of oral histories to ensure that when the last eyewitness passed away, the memory would not. These modern tools, though far removed from the battlefields of Normandy, served a crucial purpose, bridging the gap between memory and myth, between history and humanity. As time wore on, countries once divided by the war found ways to reconcile. Germany, burdened with the weight of its past, became one of the most vocal defenders of human rights and democratic values. Japan, rebuilt from the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, became a symbol of resilience and peace. Former enemies became allies. Trade, diplomacy, and shared culture replaced bayonets and suspicion. Yet the lessons of D-Day remained urgent. Genocide was not confined to the past. The potential for tyranny never disappeared. And so, every year, at cemeteries like Colville-sur-Mer or Béziers, at the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc and the sands of Juneau in Utah, people gather not only to grieve, but to be reminded, because freedom is not self-sustaining. It must be guarded, taught, passed down like a flame in trembling hands. The veterans understood this. Many spent their final years visiting schools, speaking to young audiences not to boast, but to warn, to tell them what happened when the world ignored fascism, when leaders spoke of purity and conquest, and when people stayed silent while others were taken away. They taught, most of all, the value of decency. That dignity was not earned through power, but through service. That to stand up for someone else at risk to yourself is the highest form of courage. In their final decades, many veterans made pilgrimages back to Normandy. They stood on the exact beach where they had once watched friends fall. Some wept, some prayed, some placed a hand on a cross and simply whispered a name. A few walked into the water and let the tide touch their boots one last time. For them, the circle was complete. They had come back not as conquerors, but as caretakers of memory. And the people of France never forgot. Children left flowers. Mayors gave speeches. Church bells rang across quiet towns. Each visit became a moment of international communications. Once at war, now united in gratitude for the world. D-Day became more than a military operation. It became a symbol of moral clarity in a century clouded by complexity. It showed that when good people act together, even the mightiest fortress can be breached. It showed that freedom, though fragile, can be reclaimed. And it proved that the cost of inaction is always higher than the cost of resistance. Today, in an era of division and doubt, the story of June 6, 1944, speaks to us more than ever. It asks us what we are willing to stand for, what we are willing to sacrifice for each other, what kind of world we want to leave behind. The answers are not easy, but they are there in the waves that still roll across the beaches of Normandy, in the shadows cast by marble crosses at dusk, in the letters saved in drawers, in the black and white footage of men running headlong into history. As the last of the D-Day veterans fade into memory, their legacy lives not in monuments alone, but in the values we choose to uphold in their name. Every generation is faced with its own battle, some with bullets, some with ballots, some with ideas that threaten to divide and dehumanize. The story of those who stormed the beaches on June 6, 1944, is not frozen in the past. It is a living lesson in what happens when people believe in something greater than fear. Those soldiers were not legends when they landed. They were not marble statues or names on plaques. They were young, scared, soaked in seawater and sweat, praying not for glory but simply to survive the day. And yet they moved forward, not because they were fearless, but because they understood that some things are worth facing fear for. They remind us that peace is not a gift, but a duty, that to inherit a free world is to carry its burden with humility. It is to protect not only our own freedom, but the dignity of others. In the decades since that longest day, the world has changed in every imaginable way. Empires have fallen, borders redrawn, ideologies risen and collapsed. We live now in an age of algorithms, satellites, and instant communication. And yet the most profound truths remain unchanged, that every life matters, that courage still humbles us, and that sacrifice is the currency of liberty. What those men did in 1944 will never be outpaced by technology or time. They left footprints in history that no tide can wash away, and in the simplest of ways, their spirit continues. In classrooms where students learn not just about war, but about what it means to choose justice. In the handshake between nations once at odds, in the silence observed on Remembrance Days, in the child placing a flower on a grave marked unknown, in the aging widow who still writes letters to the husband she lost on the beach, placing them gently on his headstone with trembling hands, in the son of a soldier who returns to Normandy, not to weep, but to say, "I remember." That act alone defies forgetfulness, because forgetting is the true enemy, not Germany, not Japan, not any one nation, but the human tendency to look away, to grow numb, to become careless with the truth. That is what history warns us against. That is the evil of tyrants, but the silence of those who know better. And so, when we remember the young men who landed that day, we also remember those who resisted quietly, who hid Jewish children in their basements, who smuggled radios under coats, who drew strength from nothing but faith, and who died not with a rifle, but with a refusal. They too were soldiers of the soul. Their names may not appear in military rosters, but they are engraved in the moral ledger of humanity in the years to come. As memorials age and voices fade, the challenge will be to keep the story alive, not as nostalgia, but as warning and as inspiration. To teach our children not only what happened, but why it mattered and still does. To understand that evil is rarely obvious at first. It often arrives in uniforms of law, cloaked in pride and patriotism, disguised as order or safety. That is why we must remember the moment when the world said no more and meant it. The moment when, across a churning sea, thousands sailed not to conquer, but to liberate. They came from farms, cities, reservations, and ghettos. They brought no promise of return, only the hope that they might do something good before they fell, and many did fall. In hedgerows and minefields, in foxholes and burning tanks, on beaches and in skies. Some never fired a shot. Some were medics who died, saving others. Some were cooks, drivers, signalers, translators. No role was small, no loss unworthy of honor. Behind every number was a mother who waited, a sister who prayed, a photograph kept under a helmet, a letter never sent. War has many fronts, but the human heart is always its most vulnerable battlefield. And it is that humanity that outlasts the guns. Even now, the story of D-Day calls out to us not as myth, but as measure. It asks, when the world needed defenders, what did we do? When liberty was threatened, where did we stand? In a time of rising division, their unity is a map back to ourselves. In a culture tempted by selfishness, their sacrifice is the counterpoint. In a society overwhelmed by noise, their silence from the grave is the clearest voice of all. And so, we close the story not with an end, but with a promise, that we will not let the lessons die, that we will carry their memory not only in parades or ceremonies, but in our actions, that we will confront tyranny wherever it rises, be it political, cultural, or personal, that we will lift each other as they lifted an entire continent, that we will remember to those who landed in the dawn light of Normandy, to those who never returned, to those who lived with the memory and still smiled, and to those who ask even, now what difference it made, this is your answer. It made all the difference. It bought a future. It shaped a world. And though the sand may shift, and the names may blur, and the graves may grow moss, the story will remain. Whoever you were, anonymous in a helmet, silent in a foxhole, brave in the face of the impossible, are not forgotten. You are the reason we are here, and for everything you gave, for every second you bought us, for every hope you kept alive across oceans and generations, thank you.